Samantha Green was the kind of woman who could silence a room simply by walking in. She was in her late 20s, with a sharp mind and a compassionate heart, known for her work in biotechnology and her commitment to her community. By day, Samantha was a promising researcher, spending hours in the lab developing cutting-edge medical diagnostics, driven by a desire to make healthcare accessible and affordable for all. By night, she volunteered at local youth centers, teaching young girls self-defense and encouraging them to pursue their dreams, just as her father, Henry, had encouraged her. Her life was a blend of science and service, shaped by her own drive and her father's influence. Henry Green, Samantha's father, was a local legend in his own right. A retired martial artist and former instructor in combat training, he had dedicated his life to his family and his community, running a small dojo where he taught self-defense to kids from underprivileged neighborhoods. Henry was known for his quiet strength, his calm demeanor, and the powerful presence he commanded with a single look. His years of training had given him not only physical skill but a deep mental discipline. He knew how to read people, sense danger, and when necessary, defend those he loved. To Samantha, her father was more than a mentor, he was a protector, a man who embodied resilience and integrity. On this particular evening, Samantha had stayed late at the lab to complete a project, engrossed in her work. The quiet hum of the laboratory equipment was a comforting sound, a stark contrast to the tension of the world outside. As the clock neared midnight, she finally decided to head home. The neighborhood around the lab was not the safest after dark, but Samantha was no stranger to walking alone. Besides, she had her father's teachings in the back of her mind: keep your senses sharp, walk with confidence, and trust your instincts. She took her usual shortcut home, which led her through an industrial area near the old, disused train depot, to a place that was quiet and empty at this hour, save for the occasional passing car. The air was cool and still, and Samantha walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She was used to walking through these streets alone. They had an eerie calmness to them, a silence that felt almost comforting. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, a weight that pressed on her chest as she walked. She quickened her pace, her hand instinctively moving to the small knife she kept concealed in her jacket pocket, just in case. Just as Samantha was nearing the train tracks that ran through the area, she noticed a figure moving in the shadows. A man, dressed in a police uniform, stood near the tracks, leaning against a rail with an unsettling air of calm about him. At first, she thought he might be on duty, patrolling the area. But something about his posture, the way he looked at her as she approached, made her uneasy. His stance was too relaxed, too deliberate, as if he was waiting for something or someone. Officer Tom Willis was not your average cop. He had a reputation among his colleagues for being tough and uncompromising, but beneath that exterior was a man with a history of pushing boundaries, a man who harbored deep-seated biases that he masked behind his badge. In his mind, the streets needed someone like him, a figure of authority unafraid to make snap judgments and take necessary actions to keep people in line. But Willis's judgments were often clouded by prejudice, especially when it came to people who didn't fit his view of who belonged in certain areas. Tonight, he was patrolling the industrial zone, supposedly watching for trespassers and suspicious activities. But in reality, he was looking for an outlet for his frustration, a way to remind someone who was in control. When he saw Samantha approaching, he felt a surge of irritation mixed with something darker. Here was a young black woman, alone in an area where, in his mind, she didn't belong. Without a second thought, he stepped into her path, blocking her way. His presence was menacing, his eyes cold and assessing. Out a little late, aren't we? Willis's voice was low, dripping with disdain. There was no friendliness, no pretense of a routine check. His gaze lingered on her in a way that made Samantha's skin crawl. Samantha felt a jolt of alarm but maintained her composure. She had encountered authority figures who treated her with suspicion before, but this felt different, more personal, more sinister. "I'm just on my way home," she replied, keeping her voice steady. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but her instincts told her that this man was looking for trouble. "Home," Willis smirked, taking a step closer. "Funny place to be taking a stroll at this hour. You know this area isn't safe, don't you?" The insinuation was clear. He wasn't concerned about her safety, he was using his position to intimidate her, to assert his power over someone he viewed as inferior. Samantha felt her heart race, but she stood her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. "Thank you for the concern, officer, but I'll be fine," she said, her tone cool and controlled. But Willis wasn't finished. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with an edge that made Samantha's blood run cold. "People like you don't just walk around here and leave whenever they feel like it." Samantha's instincts screamed at her to fight, to pull away, but she knew that one wrong move could escalate the situation beyond her control. She forced herself to stay calm, to think clearly. "Let go of me," she said firmly, trying to pull her arm free. "I haven't done anything wrong." Willis's smirk only widened. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" He pulled her closer, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "You're going to learn some respect tonight." Without another word, Willis dragged her toward the train tracks, ignoring her protests and attempts to free herself. Samantha's heart pounded as she struggled against him, realizing with mounting horror that this was not a routine stop, this was something far darker. She tried to scream, but Willis tightened his grip, silencing her with a warning glance that conveyed his intention all too clearly. He threw her down onto the tracks, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a length of rope he had brought along for just such an occasion. With a cruel efficiency, he tied her hands and feet, securing her to the metal rails with knots so tight they bit into her skin. Samantha struggled, her mind racing, but the binds held firm. She could hear the faint rumble of an approaching train in the distance, and a wave of terror washed over her. "Enjoy the show," Willis sneered, stepping back to admire his work. He watched her with a twisted satisfaction, relishing the fear in her eyes. "You know, I've always thought people like you needed a lesson in humility. Tonight you're going to get it." As the sound of the train grew louder, Samantha felt a surge of adrenaline, her survival instincts kicking in. She wouldn't let this man take her life, she wouldn't let him win. Gritting her teeth, she began to twist her wrists against the ropes, ignoring the pain as she fought to free herself. Somewhere deep inside, a voice urged her on, a voice that sounded like her father's "Don't give up. Fight back." The train's whistle blared, a deafening sound that filled the night, and Samantha felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. She was running out of time, but she wasn't done fighting. She would find a way out or die trying. Bound to the cold metal of the tracks, Samantha's mind raced, each second feeling like an eternity as she struggled against the ropes biting into her wrists and ankles. The vibration of the approaching train coursed through the steel rails beneath her, making her heart pound harder. Her body was taut with adrenaline and terror, yet somewhere within her, a fierce resolve burned. This was not how her life was supposed to end, not at the hands of a twisted cop with a superiority complex. As she twisted her wrists, the rough fibers of the rope scraped her skin raw, but she ignored the pain. She remembered a trick her father had once taught her about loosening knots by rolling them against a hard surface. With all the strength she could muster, she pressed her wrists against the edge of the rail, trying to grind down the knots. The progress was agonizingly slow, but she could feel the rope loosening, thread by thread. Officer Willis stood a short distance away, arms crossed and an expression of smug satisfaction on his face as he watched her desperate struggle. He didn't move to stop her attempts to free herself. If anything, he seemed amused by her futile efforts. He took out his phone and pretended to text, feigning nonchalance, though Samantha could see the flicker of excitement in his eyes. "You're wasting your energy," he called out with a mocking tone, his voice cutting through the night. "No one's going to hear you out here. And even if they did, who'd believe you over me?" He laughed, the sound hollow and chilling in the stillness of the industrial yard. Samantha clenched her jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of showing fear. Her mind shifted from terror to anger, a seething rage at the thought that he believed he could do this to her without consequence, that he saw her as nothing more than a plaything to satisfy his twisted need for control. But she couldn't let that anger consume her focus. She needed to survive this first. As she continued to work at the rope, a new sound broke the silence. The rumbling of the train was now accompanied by a faint beeping sound coming from her wrist. Her smartwatch, equipped with an emergency alert feature that activated if her heart rate exceeded a certain threshold, had sensed her panic. The signal was automatic, a feature she had added for late-night walks. Somewhere, the alert had been sent out, and her father, Henry, would be receiving it. Back in his small, dimly lit apartment, Henry was sipping a cup of tea after a long day at the dojo when his phone buzzed with an insistent, urgent notification. The screen flashed with an emergency alert from Samantha's smartwatch, signaling that she was in distress. His body tensed, every instinct on high alert. Samantha was smart, capable and cautious, so for her to send an emergency signal, something must have gone terribly wrong. Without a moment's hesitation, Henry grabbed his jacket and car keys, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who had been trained to handle crises. His heart pounded as he sped out of his apartment, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what could have happened. He knew the route Samantha took, knew the areas she felt safe walking through, and as he drove toward the old depot, a sense of dread grew within him. He barely allowed himself to consider the worst, but his fatherly intuition told him that this was serious. Meanwhile, on the tracks, Samantha had managed to loosen one of the ropes around her wrist enough to wiggle her hand free, though the skin was scraped and bleeding. She moved swiftly, untying her other hand, her eyes darting between her hands and the rapidly approaching lights of the train. The engine's roar was louder now, the sound vibrating through her bones. She reached down, working frantically to free her ankles, her breath shallow and quick as she raced against time. Willis noticed her progress, his amusement giving way to irritation. He stepped forward, his face twisted in anger as he kicked the loose rope away from her reach. "Didn't I tell you it was pointless?" He sneered, his voice low and filled with menace. "You really don't know when to give up, do you?" Samantha glared up at him, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not giving up," she spat, her voice strong and unwavering despite her fear. "And you're going to regret this." "Oh, really?" he smirked, crouching down to look her in the eyes, his face inches from hers. "And what are you going to do about it? Scream? Beg for mercy? Newsflash, sweetheart, there's no one coming to save you." He reached out, pressing down on her shoulder, pinning her harder against the tracks. The sheer cruelty in his gaze sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to show weakness. If this was going to be her last moment, she wouldn't let it be one of fear. But then, something shifted in the air. Willis's smug expression faltered as the sound of an approaching vehicle broke through the distant hum of the train. Headlights illuminated the dark industrial yard, and a car came skidding to a halt nearby. The door flew open, and out stepped Henry Green, his silhouette cast in sharp relief against the car's headlights, His face was a mask of controlled fury, his posture rigid with purpose. Willis stood up, his face contorting with annoyance at the unexpected interruption. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, clearly irritated. Henry's gaze locked onto Samantha, and in an instant he assessed the situation. His daughter, bound to the tracks, the train bearing down, and this officer standing over her with a look of predatory satisfaction. Fury roared through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Get away from her," he said, his voice cold, calm, and deadly. Willis scoffed, taking a step back but still standing between Henry and Samantha. "This is official business, old man. Back off before you get yourself in trouble." Henry didn't flinch. He moved closer, his every movement controlled, his eyes never leaving the officer. "If you don't move, you'll regret it," he warned, his voice a low growl. For a moment, Willis hesitated, sensing the underlying strength in Henry's tone, but arrogance won out, and he sneered, gesturing to the badge on his chest. "You think I'm afraid of you? I'm the law here." Henry's eyes narrowed, and without another word, he moved with the speed and precision of a trained fighter. In a swift motion, he grabbed Willis by the wrist, twisting it sharply, forcing the officer to his knees with a cry of pain. Before Willis could react, Henry's other hand came down on his shoulder, immobilizing him as he leaned in close. "You're nothing but a coward," Henry hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with contempt. "And you're going to pay for what you've done." With a sharp twist, Henry dislocated Willis's shoulder, the sickening pop echoing in the night as the officer screamed in agony. Henry released him, and Willis crumpled to the ground, clutching his injured arm, his face pale with shock and pain. Ignoring the officer, Henry rushed to Samantha, who was still partially tied to the tracks. He knelt down, his hands trembling slightly as he freed her ankles, his face softening with relief and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with the warmth and reassurance only a father could give. Samantha nodded, though her body was still shaking. "I am now," she whispered, feeling a wave of relief wash over her as her father helped her to her feet. She leaned into his embrace for a moment, drawing strength from his presence. The train roared past, its thunderous passage a stark reminder of how close she had come to the edge. Henry held her tightly, feeling her heartbeat gradually slow against his chest. He knew the nightmare wasn't over, but for now she was safe. Behind them, Willis writhed on the ground, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. "You'll pay for this," he spat, struggling to his feet. "Both of you think you can get away with attacking an officer." Henry turned slowly, his eyes cold and unyielding. "We're done here," he said simply, dismissing Willis as if he were nothing. Then, with his arm protectively around Samantha, he led her away, leaving the disgraced officer alone in the dark. The silence that settled over the rail yard after Henry's intervention was thick with unspoken tension. The train had thundered past, carrying with it the echoes of what might have been Samantha's final moments. She clung to her father, drawing strength from his presence, but she couldn't shake the residual terror that lingered in her veins. The image of Officer Willis's face, twisted with malice as he tied her to the tracks, remained seared into her memory. But now Willis was struggling to his feet, his face contorted with a blend of rage, pain, and disbelief. His right arm hung limp, dislocated from the shoulder, but the fury in his eyes burned brighter than any physical agony. This was a man who had wielded authority like a weapon his entire career, a man who was used to bending others to his will without resistance. To have been overpowered and humiliated by someone he deemed inferior was more than he could bear. Henry turned his back to Willis, his focus entirely on Samantha as he held her shoulders, looking her over to make sure she wasn't injured. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked, his voice gentle, a stark contrast to the fierce, controlled rage he had shown moments before. Samantha shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm okay, Dad," but the tremor in her voice betrayed her shaken state, and Henry's heart clenched at the sight of his daughter, usually so strong and self-assured, reduced to this fragile state by one man's cruelty. Behind them, Willis let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed across the yard. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea what you've just done." Henry released Samantha and slowly turned to face Willis, his expression unreadable. He knew that men like Willis thrived on intimidation, on a sense of power that came from lording over others. But he also knew that fear was a double-edged sword, and right now Willis's fear of losing control was driving him to recklessness. "You should be thinking about what you've done," Henry said, his voice calm, but with an edge that could cut steel. "You crossed a line tonight, and you know it." Willis staggered forward, clutching his dislocated shoulder, his face pale but eyes blazing. "I'm a police officer," he hissed, each word dripping with disdain. "You think anyone's going to believe your story over mine? You assaulted an officer, and that's all anyone needs to know." Samantha, regaining her composure, stepped forward, standing beside her father. The fear was still there, but now it was mingled with anger, a fierce, righteous anger that burned away her paralysis. "You tried to kill me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You abused your power and left me to die," Willis sneered. "Who's going to believe you? A girl who was snooping around in an abandoned rail yard at night, or an officer with years of service and a spotless record?" He straightened as much as his injury allowed, his gaze shifting between them, calculating, assessing. He was a man cornered, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. "You two don't stand a chance. I'll make sure you both regret this." Henry took a step closer, his body language calm but radiating authority. "Let me make something clear to you," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You're not the first person to try to scare me or my daughter, but you're going to be the last person who ever tries to hurt her." Willis's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you can intimidate me? You're just another thug trying to play hero. But when my colleagues hear about this, they'll come down on you like a hammer. You're finished." Samantha's eyes narrowed, her initial fear dissolving in the face of her father's strength and the realization that they had something Willis didn't: each other. She reached out, placing a hand on her father's arm, grounding both him and herself. She had endured his threats, but she wasn't going to let him manipulate or intimidate them anymore. "What happened tonight is going to come out," she said firmly. "Maybe not through the police, but people will know. You won't be able to hide what you did." Willis's expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He opened his mouth to retort, but his words died on his lips as the sound of a car engine cut through the night. Another set of headlights appeared at the far end of the yard, illuminating the grim tableau: Samantha standing with her father, and Willis, clutching his dislocated shoulder, rage contorting his face. A young officer, clearly fresh on the job, stepped out of the patrol car. He was visibly startled by the scene before him, his hand instinctively hovering near his radio as he took in the tension-filled standoff. "Officer Willis," he called, his voice uncertain. "Is everything all right here?" Willis straightened, forcing a look of authority onto his face, despite his disheveled state. "Everything's under control, Officer Jensen," he said, his tone dripping with forced confidence. "These two were trespassing, and things got out of hand." Jensen's eyes flicked to Henry and Samantha, taking in their tense postures and the way Samantha's wrists were red and raw from where the ropes had chafed her skin. His gaze shifted to Willis's injured shoulder, and for a brief moment he seemed to be calculating the likelihood of Willis's version of events. "Is that true?" Jensen asked, directing his question to Henry and Samantha, though his gaze lingered on Samantha, sensing her distress. Henry looked Jensen square in the eye, his voice steady. "Officer Willis assaulted my daughter and attempted to harm her. I stopped him. He's trying to cover his tracks now, but he knows exactly what he did." Jensen's brow furrowed, the uncertainty on his face deepening. He wasn't sure what to believe, but he could see that something was off. The signs of struggle on Samantha's wrists, the dislocated shoulder of his superior officer, it didn't add up. He was young, inexperienced, and unsure how to proceed, but he could feel that there was more to this story. "Is that true, Officer Willis?" Jensen asked, his tone cautious but pressing. Did you really assault this woman?" Willis's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly masked it, adopting a look of indignation. "They attacked me, Officer Jensen. I was simply trying to do my duty, and this thug," he jabbed a finger in Henry's direction, "decided to play vigilante. He's dangerous, and she was complicit." Jensen's hesitation grew, his gaze shifting between the two sides. He was beginning to sense that Willis's version wasn't entirely credible, but he was also wary of challenging a superior officer so openly. The politics of the force weighed on him, the pressure to obey and support his fellow officers conflicting with his growing suspicion. Henry sensed the young officer's conflict and decided to appeal to his sense of duty. "You're new, aren't you, Officer Jensen?" he asked, his tone almost gentle. "You haven't been on the force long enough to be jaded by people like him. You joined because you wanted to protect people, didn't you?" Jensen looked down, his cheeks flushing slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. I wanted to make a difference." Henry nodded, his gaze steady and sincere. "Then don't let men like Willis destroy that. Don't let him manipulate you into covering up his crimes. You know what you're seeing here. You know this isn't right." Willis's face turned a furious shade of red, and he took a step forward, despite the pain in his shoulder. "You listen to me, Jensen," he growled. "I'm your superior officer, and you're going to follow my lead. If you want a future on this force, you'll stand down and report this as an assault on a cop. Do you understand?" Jensen's face twisted with uncertainty, caught between his loyalty to the badge and the creeping realization that his superior might not be the man he thought he was. His hand hovered over his radio, indecision flickering across his features. Samantha stepped forward, meeting Jensen's gaze with a look of quiet determination. "Please," she said softly, her voice tinged with vulnerability and strength. "You don't have to be like him. You can be better than that. Do the right thing." Jensen hesitated, looking back at Willis, who was seething with barely contained rage. For a long, tense moment, the young officer wavered, his fingers twitching over his radio as he weighed his options. Finally, with a deep breath, he lowered his hand, his decision clear. "I'll need to file a report," he said, his voice steadying as he looked back at Henry and Samantha. "And I'll need statements from both of you." He looked at Willis, his face hardening with newfound resolve. "And from you as well, Officer Willis." Willis's expression crumbled, his authority slipping through his fingers as he realized that he had lost control. He glared at Jensen, his lips curling into a snarl. "You're making a big mistake, kid. This'll ruin you." Jensen met his gaze without flinching, his voice calm but resolute. "Maybe. But I'm not going to ruin myself by lying for you." With that, Jensen reached for his radio, calling for backup and requesting a supervisor to the scene. Samantha felt a wave of relief wash over her, and she leaned into her father's embrace, feeling a sense of safety that had seemed so distant moments before. The night was far from over, and the fight for justice had only just begun. But for the first time, Samantha felt hope. The industrial rail yard was bathed in cold, artificial light as more police vehicles pulled up, their red and blue lights casting an eerie glow across the scene. Officers stepped out, looking from Samantha and Henry to the disheveled and furious Officer Willis, who still clutched his dislocated shoulder with a mix of pain and indignation. The previously deserted area was now filled with a tense, almost palpable energy, as everyone tried to make sense of what had transpired. Officer Jensen stood close to Samantha and Henry, visibly nervous but resolute. This was a pivotal moment in his career, and he knew it. He had crossed an unspoken line by standing up to a superior, and the implications of his actions were just beginning to dawn on him. But something in Samantha's eyes, a quiet plea for justice mixed with resilience, had given him the courage he needed to choose integrity over loyalty to a corrupt system. An older officer with a stern face, Sergeant Laura Mitchell, stepped forward. She was a seasoned veteran who had seen more than her share of departmental conflicts and knew how to read a situation. Her sharp gaze moved from Willis to Samantha, taking in the signs of struggle, the bruises on Samantha's wrists, the anger simmering in Henry's eyes, and the subtle defiance in Jensen's posture. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Her question hung in the air, a challenge to each person present to explain themselves. Willis immediately tried to take control, straightening up despite the pain in his shoulder. "Sergeant, I was in the process of detaining a trespasser and her accomplice when this thug," he gestured at Henry, "assaulted me and dislocated my shoulder. They attacked an officer in the line of duty." Samantha couldn't contain herself any longer. "That's not what happened," she said, her voice firm, but the trauma of the night still visible in her eyes. "Officer Willis attacked me. He tied me to the train tracks and left me there to die. If my father hadn't come, I wouldn't be here right now." A murmur ran through the assembled officers, many of them exchanging glances of disbelief and unease. Willis's claim sounded almost plausible until they heard Samantha's version, a horrifying accusation that painted a very different picture. The idea of one of their own committing such an act was difficult to comprehend, but the raw sincerity in Samantha's voice made them pause. Sergeant Mitchell raised a hand, silencing the growing whispers. "Is there any evidence to support these accusations?" she asked, looking first at Samantha, then at Henry. Henry took a step forward. "The rope is still there on the tracks," he said, his voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "You'll find her blood on it, and the knots are still fresh. Check it, and you'll see she's telling the truth." Mitchell nodded to one of her junior officers, who went to examine the tracks while she continued to assess the situation. "And you, Officer Jensen," she turned to the young officer, her expression unreadable. "You were the first on the scene. What did you see?" Jensen swallowed, his nervousness evident, but he didn't waver. "When I arrived, I saw Officer Willis with a dislocated shoulder, and Mr. Green here was standing between him and his daughter. But based on how Miss Green looked, her wrists, the way she was standing, it seemed like she'd been through something traumatic. She didn't look like someone who had just attacked an officer." Willis scoffed, rolling his eyes. "So now we're taking testimony from rookies who don't know the first thing about police work." His voice was filled with disdain, but his bravado was beginning to crack under the weight of the accumulating evidence. The officer who had gone to inspect the tracks returned, holding up a length of rope with traces of blood on it. "Sergeant, it's as they said. The rope was tied tightly around the rail, and there are blood stains. Looks like they came from Miss Green's wrists." Mitchell's expression hardened, and she turned to Willis, her gaze piercing. "Do you have an explanation for this, Officer Willis?" Willis's face twisted with anger and desperation. He opened his mouth, clearly ready to launch into another defense, but the sight of the blood-streaked rope held his tongue. He looked around, realizing that his usual tactics of intimidation and manipulation weren't going to work here. Panic flashed in his eyes as he struggled to find a way out. It's not what it looks like," he stammered, his voice losing its previous confidence. She was resisting. I was forced to restrain her. She was acting hostile. Mitchell's patience was wearing thin. Tying someone to train tracks is not standard procedure, Officer Willis. This is not an action that can be explained away as restraint. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. This is a serious accusation. If Miss Green's story is corroborated, you're looking at attempted murder. The color drained from Willis's face. He shifted uncomfortably, his good hand twitching at his side as he struggled to keep his composure. "This is ridiculous. She's just saying that because she knows you'll believe her over me. This is all an act. Her father probably taught her how to play the victim." Samantha's fists clenched at her sides, her anger bubbling to the surface. But Henry placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, silently reminding her to stay calm. This was far from over, but losing control now would only give Willis more ammunition to twist the situation. Sergeant Mitchell, however, was no fool. She had been on the force long enough to see through Willis's facade. His defensiveness, the shifting blame, it was all too familiar. She had seen officers like him before, officers who used their power to hide their insecurities and prejudices. Her face remained impassive as she turned to the other officers. "We're taking statements from everyone involved," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Officer Willis, you'll be coming back to the station with us. And I expect a full report on why you thought it was appropriate to engage in such unorthodox measures." Willis tried to argue, but Mitchell silenced him with a cold stare. "You've overstepped, and you know it. If you want any hope of defending yourself, you'll cooperate." Realizing that he had no other choice, Willis nodded reluctantly, his face set in a tight, bitter expression. The officers led him to one of the squad cars, leaving Samantha, Henry, Jensen, and Mitchell standing in the rail yard. The other officers began processing the scene, taking photos and cataloging evidence, but the tension between those four remained thick and heavy. Mitchell turned to Samantha and Henry, her expression softening just a fraction. "Miss Green, Mr. Green, I know this has been a traumatic experience, but I want you to know that we're going to take this seriously. We'll ensure that all evidence is carefully reviewed, and we'll be transparent with the findings." Samantha nodded, her body still trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. "Thank you, Sergeant. I just want justice. I want people like him to know they can't keep getting away with this." Mitchell's gaze softened even more. "Believe me, we're working to change that. It's officers like Willis who make it harder for the rest of us to do our jobs honorably. But justice doesn't always come quickly. You need to prepare yourself for that." Henry nodded, his expression one of grim understanding. He knew all too well how systems worked, how easily evidence could be twisted or cases could be dragged out until people lost hope. But he also knew that this was a fight worth having, not just for his daughter, but for everyone who had ever been victimized by someone in a position of power. "I understand," he said quietly. "But we're not backing down." Mitchell held his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She admired his strength, his resolve, and she hoped that their willingness to fight would spark change, if only in a small way. Samantha glanced at Officer Jensen, who still looked a bit shaken but resolute. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying gratitude and respect. "If it weren't for you standing up, I don't know what would have happened." Jensen looked down, a bit embarrassed, but he managed a small smile. I couldn't stand by and let him get away with it. I became an officer to help people, not to cover for people like him." Samantha nodded, feeling a sense of relief knowing that not everyone on the force was like Willis. They were good people, people who would stand up for what was right, even when it meant standing against one of their own. And that knowledge, small as it was, gave her a glimmer of hope. Sergeant Mitchell took a step back, motioning toward the vehicles. "Let's head back to the station. We'll need formal statements, and you might want to call your attorney." Henry put an arm around Samantha, guiding her toward their car. "We're ready," he replied, casting one last look at the rail yard, the place where his daughter had nearly lost her life, and where justice had begun to take shape. It was a small step, but an important one. Hours later, the fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the tense scene unfolding inside. Samantha and Henry sat in a small interview room, the silence weighing heavily on them as they waited for Sergeant Mitchell to return. The events of the night had left Samantha physically and emotionally drained, but she forced herself to stay alert, her mind racing as she replayed every moment over and over again. Beside her, Henry exuded a quiet strength, his presence steady and grounding, though Samantha could sense the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Across the hall, Officer Willis was seated in another interview room, his expression dark and sullen. His shoulder had been reset and bandaged, but the humiliation of the night lingered far deeper than any physical wound. He was a man on edge, pacing the room restlessly, his mind churning with thoughts of revenge, retribution, and a desperate need to regain control. He had always operated with impunity, using his badge as a shield, but tonight his authority had been publicly shattered, and the thought gnawed at him like a festering wound. After what felt like an eternity, Sergeant Mitchell entered the room where Samantha and Henry waited, carrying a stack of paperwork and a weary expression. She took a seat across from them, offering a small nod of acknowledgement before beginning. "Thank you for your patience," she said, her tone professional but laced with empathy. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult night, and I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to ensure that justice is served." Samantha nodded, though a flicker of doubt passed over her face. "Willis tried to kill me," she said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion and anger. "And if he gets away with this, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again." Mitchell's gaze softened. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady but sincere. "And I promise you we're not letting this slide. There's enough evidence to open an internal investigation, and with Officer Jensen's statement supporting yours, we have a strong case against Willis." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This won't be easy. Willis has connections within the department, and there are people who may try to protect him, even now." Henry's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. "So what you're saying is, despite everything he did, there's still a chance he could walk away from this?" Mitchell sighed, a resigned look in her eyes. "There's always a chance. The system has its flaws, and people like Willis know how to exploit them. But that doesn't mean we're powerless. We have evidence, witnesses, and the determination to see this through. It's just, you need to be prepared for a fight." A heavy silence settled over the room as Mitchell's words sank in. Samantha looked down at her hands, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. She had been through hell that night, and the thought of facing more battles in a system that might still protect her attacker was almost too much to bear. But then she looked at her father, his unwavering expression of support and resolve, and felt a surge of strength. "We're ready," she said firmly, meeting Mitchell's gaze with newfound determination. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Mitchell nodded approvingly, admiration flickering in her eyes. "That's what I wanted to hear. We'll keep you updated as the investigation progresses, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure Willis faces the consequences." At that moment the door opened, and Officer Jensen stepped in, looking slightly out of place but resolute. He glanced at Mitchell, who gave him a subtle nod, before turning to Samantha and Henry. "I just wanted to check in," he said, his voice tentative but sincere. "I know this can't be easy, but I want you to know that I'm standing with you. Willis's actions were wrong, and if anyone tries to cover for him, I'll speak up." Samantha managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Officer Jensen. You don't know how much that means to us." Jensen gave a shy nod, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but determined to do the right thing. He had chosen his side, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he was prepared to face whatever consequences came his way. After a few more minutes of discussion, Mitchell excused herself to begin the paperwork for the internal investigation, leaving Samantha, Henry, and Jensen alone in the interview room. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them like a shroud. But just as they began to gather their thoughts, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Raised voices, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the unmistakable click of heavy boots echoed through the station. Samantha's heart skipped a beat, a surge of anxiety flooding her veins as she exchanged a worried glance with her father. Moments later, a high-ranking officer strode into the room, his expression hard and unyielding. Captain Richard Thomas was a man of considerable influence within the department, known for his no-nonsense approach and his deep-seated loyalty to his officers. He was a figure who inspired both respect and fear, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. He fixed his gaze on Samantha and Henry, his eyes cold and calculating. "I understand there's been an incident," he said, his tone sharp and accusatory, "and that Officer Willis has been accused of some very serious charges. I am here to ensure that this situation is handled appropriately." Henry bristled at the underlying hostility in Thomas's tone, his protective instincts flaring as he squared his shoulders. "With all due respect, Captain, incident is an understatement. Your officer tried to kill my daughter." Captain Thomas's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he assessed Henry with a look of barely concealed disdain. "Those are strong words, Mr. Green, and you should be careful with accusations like that. Officer Willis is a respected member of this department, and it's not in his character to engage in the behavior you're describing." Samantha felt a surge of anger rise within her, the sheer injustice of Thomas's words igniting a fierce determination. "I'm not making this up," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "There are witnesses, evidence, everything you need to see that he's guilty." Thomas's expression didn't soften. If anything, his resolve seemed to harden. "I understand that emotions are running high, but we have procedures in place to determine the truth. I've reviewed Officer Willis's record, and he has consistently demonstrated dedication and professionalism. I would advise you to think carefully before tarnishing his reputation." Jensen, who had been silent up until now, couldn't hold back any longer. "Captain, with all due respect, I was there. I saw the aftermath. Miss Green isn't lying, she's telling the truth. Willis crossed a line, and he deserves to be held accountable." Thomas shot Jensen a cold, reprimanding look, clearly displeased with his insubordination. "Officer Jensen, I suggest you remember your place. This is a delicate situation, and we don't need young officers overstepping their bounds." Henry took a deep breath, struggling to keep his composure in the face of Thomas's dismissive attitude. "Is this how you protect your officers, Captain? By ignoring the truth and protecting those who abuse their power?" Thomas's gaze shifted to Henry, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "I don't protect anyone who abuses their power, Mr. Green. But I also don't allow baseless accusations to ruin the careers of good men. Until we have concrete proof of wrongdoing, Officer Willis will be treated with the respect he deserves." The tension in the room was almost unbearable, the air thick with unspoken accusations and barely contained hostility. Samantha felt a sinking sensation in her stomach, the realization dawning on her that Captain Thomas was more interested in preserving the department's image than seeking justice. But Henry wasn't about to back down. He had faced down bullies before, men who hid behind power and authority, and he knew that the only way to break through their defenses was to stand firm. He met Thomas's gaze with unflinching resolve, his voice calm but steely. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded you that respect isn't something you get just because of a title," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Respect is earned by doing the right thing, by protecting the innocent, not by defending those who abuse their position." Thomas's face hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Mitchell, who had re-entered the room, watching the exchange with a mixture of concern and disapproval. "Sergeant Mitchell, you're to oversee the investigation, but I expect it to be handled delicately. This department's reputation is at stake, and I won't tolerate any unnecessary scandal." Mitchell's jaw tightened, but she nodded, her expression betraying her reluctance. "Understood, Captain." Thomas cast one last icy glance at Samantha and Henry before turning on his heel and leaving the room, his departure leaving a chilling silence in his wake. The message was clear: the fight for justice would be an uphill battle, and they would have to contend not only with Willis but with a system that was resistant to accountability. As the door closed behind him, Samantha felt a wave of despair threaten to overwhelm her, but she steadied herself, drawing strength from her father's presence. She knew now more than ever that this was a battle she couldn't afford to lose, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever been victimized by people like Willis and protected by people like Thomas. Mitchell took a deep breath, her expression a mix of frustration and determination. "We're still moving forward," she assured them, her voice resolute. "This isn't over. We'll gather every piece of evidence, interview every witness, and make sure the truth comes out. Captain Thomas may want this to go away quietly, but I won't let that happen." Henry nodded, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant. We're in this together." Jensen placed a reassuring hand on Samantha's shoulder. "We're not giving up," he said, his voice steady. "Justice isn't something we ask for, it's something we fight for, and we'll keep fighting until we see this through." In that moment, surrounded by allies who were just as determined as she was, Samantha felt a glimmer of hope reignite within her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone in this battle. And together, they would challenge the system, face down the corruption, and fight for the justice she deserved. This was only the beginning, and Samantha was prepared to go to any lengths to ensure that the truth would finally come to light. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, thick with anticipation and barely contained emotion. Samantha sat beside her father, feeling a mixture of anxiety and resolve as the trial for Officer Willis approached its climax. The past few weeks had been grueling, filled with late nights, countless interviews, and the endless reliving of that horrific night at the train tracks. Yet through it all, she had remained strong, bolstered by her father's unwavering support and the commitment of Sergeant Mitchell and Officer Jensen, who had risked their careers to stand by her. Today, however, was the day that would determine whether justice would truly be served or if the system would once again shield one of its own from accountability. Officer Willis, his arm now healed but his arrogance undiminished, sat across from her, flanked by his defense team. His expression was defiant, as if he couldn't fathom the possibility of being held accountable for his actions. He radiated a chilling confidence, secure in the belief that his status and connections within the department would protect him. The judge called for silence, and the prosecutor rose to deliver her closing argument. She was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Maria Espinosa, known for her relentless pursuit of justice. Her voice was calm, but every word cut through the air with precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you have heard the testimonies of witnesses, the evidence of the rope, and the statements of those who bravely stood up to expose the truth. Officer Willis is a man who used his badge as a shield to mask his violent tendencies, who abused his authority to exert control over a vulnerable young woman, and who, when faced with accountability, tried to manipulate and intimidate everyone around him. She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze moving across the jury. This is not just a case about one man's actions. This is about a system that for too long has allowed individuals like Officer Willis to operate without consequence. This is about whether we as a society will stand for justice or continue to let abuse hide behind authority. As she sat down, Samantha felt a surge of hope. Maria's words had captured the essence of what she had endured and what she was fighting for. But as the defense attorney rose, her heart clenched. She knew they would do everything they could to twist the narrative, to cast doubt, to paint Willis as a misunderstood officer who had simply acted in self-defense. The defense attorney, a smooth, well-dressed man named Carl Lawson, began his argument with an easy smile. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget who Officer Willis is: a decorated officer with years of service, a man who has put his life on the line to protect the people of this city. The accusations against him are based on the words of a single witness, a young woman who, though we sympathize with her, may not fully understand the pressure and complexity of law enforcement work. Lawson gestured toward Samantha with a dismissive wave, as if her suffering was nothing more than an exaggeration, a story. We've all seen cases where emotions can cloud judgment, where misunderstandings spiral out of control. Officer Willis was simply trying to perform his duty under difficult circumstances. This has been blown out of proportion. Samantha gripped the edge of the table, her frustration simmering. It was as if her trauma, her very life, was being minimized to defend a man who had nearly taken it from her. She glanced at her father, who met her gaze with a steady look of reassurance. He placed a comforting hand over hers, grounding her in the midst of her turmoil. The defense attorney continued, focusing on casting doubt, pointing out inconsistencies in minor details, and attempting to undermine Officer Jensen's credibility, claiming he was young and inexperienced, easily influenced, and unable to judge the situation accurately. Samantha could see the jury members exchanging glances, some of them clearly swayed by his words, while others remained stoic, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the judge called for a short recess before the jury would be sent to deliberate. Samantha and Henry stepped outside the courtroom for some fresh air, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "Do you think they'll believe him?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The thought that Willis might walk away free, that he might return to the force and continue his abuses, made her stomach turn. Henry's gaze was firm, unwavering. "We've done everything we could, Sam. Whatever happens, remember you were brave. You stood up and fought for what was right, and that matters no matter the outcome." As they stood there, Officer Jensen approached, his face drawn and weary. "I'm sorry for what you've had to go through," he said, his voice laced with guilt. "If I'd been stronger that night, maybe it wouldn't have come to this." Samantha shook her head, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Jensen. You didn't let him get away with it, and that's more than most would have done. None of this is your fault." They exchanged a brief, silent moment of understanding. Jensen had been through his own battle, risking his career and reputation to support her, and for that, she was deeply grateful. The three of them returned to the courtroom just as the jury filed back in, each juror taking their seat with a solemn expression. The room fell silent as the judge called for order and turned to the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing through the chamber. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm expression, stood, holding a small slip of paper. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." Samantha's heart pounded as the foreperson unfolded the paper, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for the words that would either validate her fight or crush her hope. In the matter of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Officer Tom Willis, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by hushed murmurs. Relief flooded through Samantha, her body releasing the tension she had held for so long. Tears pricked her eyes, and she felt her father's arm wrap around her shoulders, pulling her close. It was over. Justice had been served, but the foreperson wasn't finished. She continued, "In the matter of assault and battery, we also find the defendant guilty. In the matter of abuse of authority, guilty." With each word, Willis's face grew paler, his confident facade crumbling as he realized the weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. For the first time, Samantha saw fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored her own on that night at the tracks. Now, he would face the consequences he had so long evaded. The judge banged his gavel, signaling for silence as he addressed the court. "Officer Tom Willis, you have been found guilty on multiple counts. This court hereby sentences you to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole. You have abused the power entrusted to you, and this sentence serves as a reminder that no one is above the law." Willis's head dropped, his shoulders slumping as he was led away in handcuffs, his status and power stripped from him in the span of a few heartbeats. The sense of finality was overwhelming, a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still prevail. As the courtroom began to clear, Samantha turned to Sergeant Mitchell, who had been watching from the back. Mitchell nodded at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You did well, Samantha. You fought for this, and you won. I hope this brings you some peace." Samantha nodded, a soft smile breaking through her tears. "Thank you, Sergeant, for everything." Mitchell nodded and looked to Henry, her gaze filled with respect. "And you, Mr. Green. I've seen a lot in this job, but the strength and loyalty you showed tonight standing by your daughter, fighting for her. It's rare. You raised a warrior." Henry's expression softened as he looked at Samantha, pride evident in his eyes. "She didn't need much help from me. She's always been strong." As they stepped out of the courthouse, a sense of freedom washed over Samantha. She knew the journey wasn't over, that the scars from this ordeal would take time to heal. But for the first time since that fateful night, she felt safe. She felt like she could breathe again. Henry turned to her, his face warm with fatherly pride. "I told you we'd get through this," he said softly. Samantha nodded, the weight of the moment settling over her. "I couldn't have done it without you." They walked away from the courthouse, side by side, each step carrying them further from the nightmare that had tried to consume them. And though they had faced unimaginable darkness, they had emerged stronger, united in a bond that nothing could break. For Samantha, justice had been served not just for her, but for every victim who had been silenced, every voice that had gone unheard. And as she walked away, she knew that this victory was just the beginning of a brighter, safer future. Several weeks had passed since the trial, and life had slowly begun to return to normal for Samantha. She was back at work in the lab, her research once again taking center stage in her life. But something fundamental had shifted. The fear that had once gripped her every time she walked alone had started to dissipate, replaced by a newfound resilience, a sense of peace that she had fought so hard to earn. Her father, Henry, remained a steadfast presence in her life, checking in on her frequently, though he knew she was more than capable of standing on her own. Their bond had deepened through the ordeal, built on shared strength and mutual respect. Henry continued his work at the community center, teaching self-defense to young people, instilling in them the same sense of inner strength and resolve that he had taught Samantha. One evening, as Samantha was wrapping up at the lab, she received a call from Officer Jensen. She had kept in touch with him, their connection forged in the fire of that fateful night and the grueling trial that followed. Jensen had remained steadfast, despite facing pressure and subtle threats within the department, but he had stayed true to his commitment to the truth. He was a friend now, someone she could trust. "Hey, Samantha," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I just wanted to check in. I know things have settled down, but I thought you'd want to know." Willis tried to appeal the verdict, but it was denied. He'll be serving out his full sentence. Samantha felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Jensen, for everything. You didn't have to stand by me the way you did, but you did, and it made all the difference." Jensen chuckled, a bit self-consciously. It was the right thing to do. And honestly, seeing you stand up for yourself, seeing your dad fight for you, it reminded me of why I joined the force in the first place. To actually protect people, not just to follow orders blindly. Samantha smiled, feeling a deep gratitude. "You're one of the good ones, Jensen. Don't ever forget that." After they hung up, Samantha made her way out of the lab, stepping into the cool evening air. She breathed deeply, savoring the sense of freedom that had been so hard-won. Her thoughts drifted to the future, to the impact she wanted to make, not just in her research but in her community. The events of the past months had shown her the power of resilience, of standing up even when the odds were stacked against her. As she walked home, she passed by the community center where her father was finishing up a self-defense class. She paused by the doorway, watching as he led the young students in a series of movements, his voice calm and encouraging. There was a sense of pride in his eyes, pride that came not only from teaching but from knowing he had been able to protect his family when it mattered most. When he finished, he looked up and saw her standing there. He smiled, gesturing for her to join him. She walked over, feeling the familiar warmth of his presence, the security that came from knowing he would always be there for her. "Hey, Dad," she said softly. He smiled, pulling her into a hug. "Hey, kiddo. How was your day?" "Good," she replied, leaning into him. "I talked to Jensen. He said Willis's appeal was denied. It's over now for real." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep satisfaction. "I'm glad. But I'm even more glad to see you out here, living your life strong and unbroken." They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, each reflecting on the journey they had been through. Finally, Samantha looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Dad, do you think things will change? That people like Willis will stop abusing their power?" Henry looked thoughtful, his gaze turning distant. "I don't know if things will change overnight. People like Willis, they've existed for as long as there's been power to abuse. But every time someone stands up, every time people refuse to back down, it gets harder for them to hide. And that makes a difference." Samantha nodded, absorbing his words. She understood now that change was a process, one that required courage, persistence, and the willingness to face adversity head-on. She had faced darkness and emerged on the other side, stronger and more determined than ever to live with purpose. As they walked home together, she felt a sense of closure. She had fought for justice and found it, not just in the verdict but in the strength she had discovered within herself. Her father had been her protector, her guide, but now she understood that she had the power to protect herself and others, to inspire change and to stand up for what was right. The night sky stretched above them, vast and filled with stars, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. She felt the weight of the past months lift from her shoulders, replaced by a sense of hope, a conviction that the future, though uncertain, was one she could face with courage. For Samantha, the journey was far from over. But now, she walked forward with a new strength, a quiet resilience that no one could ever take from her. She had found justice, not just in the courtroom but within herself, and that was a victory no one could ever diminish.